This was a report from Reuters, and this is kind of an interesting article because I take great pride in the fact that this article came out because there has been this shift among men to the political right in recent years. And I think I may have even said the exact word despair is the motivating factor behind that. Lack of opportunity is what's driving this. And so here, a study cited in Reuters, despair makes young U.S. men more conservative ahead of U.S. election, poll shows. A large global survey issued on Friday showed a surge in despair and disillusionment with established politics, particularly among young American men, the only U.S. population group to turn more conservative over the past decade. The study by the international research agency Glocalites.
The opens new tab is not part of the text.
The study by the why did that happen? The study opens new tab. Yeah, that's weird. The study by the international research agency Glocalites, shared with Reuters, offered context for November's U.S. presidential poll and a plethora of votes worldwide, including a European Union parliamentary election in June. It surveyed respondents to determine their position on a scale of optimism between hope and despair, and on another between control and freedom. In other words, conservatism and liberalism. So that's interesting. The survey between hope and despair, and then control and freedom. On average, the world became more liberal between 2014 and 2023, even as it became more pessimistic, according to more than 300,000 surveys in 20 countries, representing nearly 60% of the global population. Young people the world over feel especially let down by society, said Martin Lampert, a head of research at Glocalites, adding that the surge in despair among young adults in the U.S. far outweighs the rise in despair among young adults in EU countries. Interesting. Most strikingly, young U.S. men were the only population group in the United States or 7 EU member states actually to have become more conservative since 2014, or in the poll's terms, to favor more control than freedom.
All right, so I'm just going to interject. So I looked at that to see what that probably meant. I think what they're saying is the 20 countries represent 60% of the global population. So they're assuming the surveys are accurate and accurately represent those 20 countries.
Got it. So it's 300,000 studies in the 20 countries that represent 60% of the population. Got it. Exactly. Interesting. All right. That makes much more sense. In total, 14,526 Americans were polled between 2014 and 2023, including 2,242 men aged 18 to 34. Worldwide, feelings of hopelessness, societal disillusionment, and rebelling against cosmopolitan values partly explain the rise of radical right anti-establishment parties, Lampert said, citing elections in several European countries. Social media algorithms were magnifying the trend by drawing moderately conservative young men towards more extreme and radical conservative male role models and world views. The report also highlighted a sharp difference between the world's young men and young women. Both were worried about career prospects, financial security, and education. But while men aged 18 to 24 overtook men aged 55 to 70 as the most socially conservative group. Wow. So young Gen Zers and young millennial males actually more conservative than boomers and younger Gen Xers. Who'd have thought that? Women of 18 to 24 grew more liberal and anti-patriarchal. On a scale where 1 represents the most conservative and 5 the most liberal, women worldwide aged 18 to 24 moved from 3.55 in 2014 to 3.78 in 2023, both easily the highest for any age group. Men of the same age moved from 3.29 to 3.36, and in the U.S., men of 18 to 34 age group became less liberal, dropping from 3.48 to 3.46, so about the same but slightly less. Globally, young women are likely the most liberal group in human history, the report said. Young women were worried above all about social issues such as sexual harassment, domestic violence, child abuse, and neglect, That's interesting. Young men were more geared toward achieving social and economic status and set store by conservative family values and competition, bravery, and honor. If the report offered a glimmer of optimism, it was among the world's men and women over 55, the only groups to become generally more hopeful over the decade, as well as more liberal. Well, that is also, I would argue, a reflection of their relative economic prosperity compared to the young men who feel there's no economic future for them.
They have their 401ks. They own their houses. They just got richer.
Exactly. They just got richer. So, I've said this in the past, which is, a lot of the times, despair, hopelessness is a major driver of not only culture, but of how that culture manifests in terms of how leaders come and go, how movements rise and fall. And a lot of that has to do with the culture influencing the political landscape, but also how the economic landscape influences the cultural landscape, influences the political landscape, which influences the cultural. It's a cycle.
Right.
It's a cycle. And once that cycle gets going, it becomes a chicken and the egg thing. Where did it go wrong? And where I think it went wrong is that capitalism was unleashed on the world, and that created a funneling of wealth to the top, and it left especially men feeling like they could not fulfill that primal masculine urge to provide. And to some extent, it's to conquer. Yes, there is an element of traditional masculinity that's about conquest. It's about claiming things for your own, about laying your stake in the ground. Whereas women tend to, not all the time, obviously, but tend to be more nurturing. That's why, despite this economic collapse that young people are living through, women have gotten a little more liberal, not because they don't feel that. They feel that, but men and women are different in the sense that, as a rule, women are less likely to feel as personally damaged by these kinds of macro themes as are young men. This is why girl boss feminism never really caught on, right? Because girl boss feminism was about co-opting all the worst qualities of men, shallowness, greed, conquest, and trying to claim it for women. And of course, that's a dog that won't really hunt. I understand what you mean. Well, it's caught on in certain circles, but it's not popular as a mainstream, way of life. Yeah.
A few things here. One, I would have to see the study. It could be the way that they're reporting, although I suspect not. It is a real statement on how thoroughly the so-called new left has accomplished its mission of redefining what the left is, purely along identitarian lines, that it seems that they conducted this entire survey purely evaluating what defines liberal and conservatism by cultural opinions rather than opinions on economics or class. I mean, if they did, it's not mentioned anywhere in this article, which in and of itself is pretty revealing. So I think that's a very incomplete picture. However, and I've noticed this, when I see people who are young and idealistic, when I see them do a fundraiser for their birthday or that kind of thing, it's always an identitarian fundraiser. It's always a fundraiser for LGBTQ homeless teens. It's always that. Now, back in the day, people who had that impulse went into poor neighborhoods. This was what people who had that social justice impulse would do almost by definition. They would go and expose the horrors of poverty among poor communities, regardless of race. Sometimes it was focused on certain races, but not necessarily. It was usually focused on poverty. That is how thoroughly that project has done its job, because that's exactly what they wanted. Most of these people mean well. They have an idealistic impulse. They want to help people. And they have been so brainwashed not to think about poverty, not to think about class. So the question is, why have you been told to be absolutely fixated on the one, which affects a much smaller portion of the population, by the way, than to be focused on the other? Because you cannot be focused on the other without questioning the system that created those conditions. It is much easier for our economic order to handle idealistic youth who are entirely focused on questions of identity and representation. So the fact that even this poll, it seems, just didn't even think of the idea that leftism is defined by more than cultural opinions is revealing. Now, building on what you were saying about differences between the sexes, yes, biological essentialism, we evolved for millions of years, a couple thousand years of civilization and 100 years of feminism didn't all of a sudden erase all of our biological inheritance. This is something Jordan Peterson said that I often quote, hey, stop clock, right time, twice a day. If you think strong men are dangerous, wait until you see what weak men are capable of. It is hardly a surprise that men who are more aggressive and warlike by nature, after at least a decade and maybe more of relentless attacks on their natural dispositions, toxic masculinity, men, of course. Oh, really? They turned against your political project, but you were being so charming to that demographic. I cannot imagine why they would have developed an extremely negative attitudes towards liberal politics as you presented them to these men. You turned it into a war on men. Did you ever think about what would happen when men struck back? You have really tickled the dragon's tail by taking a generation of men and telling them that they're shit, that they are to blame for all the problems of the world, and that to be male is something that you should be ashamed of. It is not, it's not something that any demographic would just accept over time. Of course, any reaction gets a counter reaction, right? If you lean that heavily on this group, particularly a very aggressive group, a group that is aggressive by nature, well, what did you think was going to happen? And these guys are going to grow up and they're going to come into power. And what do you think they're going to do to the people who they spent their entire upbringing being telling them that they were garbage? What do you think they're going to do to those elements of society? You have not even begun to see how dangerous that social engineering project is going to end up having been.
It's interesting. I mean, I don't know that explains this kind of macro shift in polling as much as economic disempowerment has.
It's a combination. Yeah. It's a combination, of course. At the same exact time that you made it, that society, the economics, it made it extremely difficult for men to achieve in the way that they expect to. At the same exact time, you have presented your political project as being inextricably linked to man hatred.
Yeah.
Of course, they ended up conservative.
Yeah, I mean, I believe it is a combination of those two, especially since we've talked about this in the past.
And that's why in America, it's trending that way, because they have a social safety net in other places.
Yeah, they have a social safety net, and the ethos of social democratic Europe is not sink or swim, and if you sink, it's because you're a failure, right? Because that hits everybody, yes, but it hits men harder. Right. And so when that is your economic ethos, it makes that despair very easy to start feeling. It makes it easier for that self-esteem to just go right down the tubes. At which point, where do you turn? Do you turn to the left, whose ethos under neoliberalism is, well, we have to help you and give you charity and give you things? No, that just makes you feel more disempowered under capitalism. Now, this is why it's important to define the left as being rooted in production and labor, because that's what true economic leftism is. True economic leftism is not about a nanny state that cares for people. True economic leftism is about worker ownership. Therefore, workers are rewarded for, with the fruits of their labor, as opposed to the fruits of their labor being siphoned off by management, by capital, right? And so economic leftism under neoliberalism, under capitalism, takes the form of something that a lot of these men, rightly or wrongly, feel is even more disempowering than the alternative, which is the conservatives, which is go out and work and we'll let you keep what's yours. Keeping what's yours. That's something that there's something masculine about that to a lot of people. Go out, earn what's yours, and keep it. Nobody else gets to touch it, right? It's simpler, first of all. It's a lot easier a pitch, right? And second of all, it's more rooted in the pursuit of something. Now, there's no reason why economic leftism cannot be rooted in that, but it can't be rooted in that under a system like this, where what passes for left wing now is a bronze plan on Obamacare, right? Now, I'm not saying you're better off without the bronze plan, because in states where they don't have Obamacare, in states where those plans are shittier, in states where there's no Medicaid expansion, people have worse outcomes, and that's disempowering, like getting sick and dying. Talk about disempowering. But the bargain is a lot more complicated. It's a lot more difficult for people to see. It's a lot less primal than I'm going to go out into the world and get what's mine and keep it. When you convolute that, when you dilute that in this language of woke, nanny state, neoliberal, is it charity? Is it pity? Right? It takes on all those forms, which does not appeal to a lot of men. As a rule, obviously, we're not talking this is true for everybody under every circumstance, but as a rule, I think that explains a real macro trend like this.
I think you're right in terms of the underlying reasons that men have long tended to trend more towards libertarianism and conservatism. Right. I mean, that's a long-standing thing. I think now you have the bizarre postmodern social project that really jacked it up with Gen Z. Hey, I was a teenage boy. If I were 15, growing up in a world like this, and I heard me some Andrew Tate, and I measured that against what I was being told by the elite liberal establishment about men, I'm an Andrew Tate fan, right?
Well,
I mean,
exactly.
it's not hard to see why he gained that kind of popularity.
No, he's an exaggerated, sort of cartoonish version of what an alpha male looks like, just as Donald Trump is an exaggerated, cartoonish version of what a successful businessman looks like, right?
Sure.
I mean, it's not a mystery that these figures are able to rise to the top under circumstances like this.
Sure.
Please clap.